Welcome back to the Leaderonomics show. Today we have with us Dr. Alan Langer from the Harvard University.
Thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about your background and how you came about, this whole concept of mindfulness and or really how you get into psychology and
that's
a long
we don't
story.
have time for all of that.
All right, sure.
But I can tell you about how I got into mindfulness.
Okay.
Which initially I was actually studying mindlessness.
Mindlessness.
I had been teaching in New York at the Graduate Center of City University for 3 years, and then I came up to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to Harvard, and there's a stereotype of everybody in Cambridge as being very, very smart and what have you. And I kept seeing things that were shocking to me that would never take place in New York. Silly little things. Well, for example, you'd go into a bank, and let's say there are 5 tellers, and on one line you'd have 1 person, on another line you'd have 8 people. In New York that would never happen. People would immediately go to, right. And that when the bank, years ago when banks used to close at 3 o'clock, so nobody was going to mind if you parked there. And in New York, people quickly would have done that, and in Cambridge not. And so I was struck by this, and I had started thinking about mindlessness earlier in New York and did the first studies there. And then it became apparent to me that this concept was very different from intelligence, that, and it's very different from notions of stupidity or habit.
And so what it is? I mean, it's shutting off your brain.
Yeah, well, if you say shutting off your brain, I think it's a little misleading because that sounds intentional. Yeah. What happens is mindlessness usually comes about by default, not by design. That most of the time it's when you assume you know. And the way you're taught almost everything is if there are single answers. And once you know, there's no reason to pay any attention. But things are constantly changing and look different from different perspectives. And so, as a result, what happens is we're frequently in error but rarely in doubt. The mindlessness comes about in 2 ways. One is when you take in this information as if it's necessarily true. The other is the way that's more familiar to people when you do things over and over and over again. And most people who drive have had the experience of all of a sudden you get to some place, how did I get here? If we didn't have that experience, I think that we would be even more oblivious to how often we're mindless. So I've been studying this now for over 30 years, and I can say that virtually all of us, sadly, virtually all the time, are not there. And the thing is that when you're not there to know you're not there. So
what's the consequence of mindlessness?
Well, the consequence is enormous. No matter what you're doing, you're doing it either mindfully or mindlessly. When you're doing it mindlessly, you're running the risk of all sorts of indirect effects, accidents and things of this sort. You don't get a chance to avert the danger before it happens. Your health, well-being, maybe it's easier for me to tell you in terms of how we've changed it all by making people mindful.
So that's the cure for mindlessness.
Right, for everything almost, as silly as it sounds, to say that there's one thing that can set the stage for success, whether personal, interpersonal, or at work. When I'm talking about mindfulness, it's different from the concept of meditation. Meditation sets you up for post-meditative mindfulness. Mindfulness, as I study it, is in some sense more online, immediate. It's the very simple process of noticing new things. Couldn't be easier. And it doesn't matter if what you notice is smart or silly, as long as it's new. Now, when it's new, that puts you in the present, makes you sensitive to context and perspective. And the interesting thing is that in this noticing, you become engaged in what you're doing. And it becomes literally and figuratively enlivening. So in early studies, we gave people opportunities, instructions to be mindful, and they end up living longer. I mean, the consequences are enormous.
Okay. They actually end up living longer.
Yeah, I have 30 years worth of research. We make people more mindful. They become more creative, innovative, more productive, happier, healthier on numerous measures. There are fewer accidents. You get a reduction in burnout. You name it.
Do you have actual examples of that? I mean, experiments?
I have 4 books outlining all of them. But thank you for the opportunity to mention those.
Do you have one example of of especially in this whole concept of being mindful and living longer?
Well, in the early studies, and there are 3 or 4 of them that we did, where we have people who are in nursing homes, who we have them make decisions, simple decisions. And in making a decision, you have to think about options, and you think about different aspects of them that you hadn't thought about before. And then we go back and take measures. And in the very first study, I guess it was a year and a half after we had initiated it, we found that twice as many people in the mindless group had died as in the mindful group. And then we've replicated that in several studies. I mean, you can feel the difference. When you're on vacation and you're just looking at things, or when you're laughing at something. Now, humor relies on being mindful. What happens is all of a sudden you see that there's another way of understanding this information, and that becomes funny. And so it's engaging, it's energy producing. So once you realize how much of your life is spent without you being there, sort of sealed in an unlived life, you quickly decide to turn it all around.
Many would say that to be mindful all the time is tiring.
Well, that's because they misunderstand. Yeah, and that's very important. That's, in fact, when I lecture, I almost always, in fact, I get that question so often that I have a slide now. I'll ask people, does anybody have any questions? And I'll give them the slide to them. Here's the question you want to ask me. Okay, so the answer is very similar to what I've already said, that thinking itself has gotten a bad name. Now, thinking isn't difficult. What's difficult is worrying that you're not going to think correctly or be able to solve the problem. So mindfulness is without evaluation. That means that there's no right way, wrong way. It's just noticing. And noticing feels good and is engaging. So
how does that translate to living longer and being healthier?
As you're noticing, there are more neurons firing, and it also helps living longer and health indirectly. Because, in the simplest way, let's say that if I were mindlessly riding a horse, and what I'm telling myself is be careful of the branches. Okay, so mindlessness is not the same thing as vigilance. When you're vigilant, you have a particular stimulus in mind. So here it's the branches. I'm going to watch out for those branches. And meanwhile, then the horse trips over a big boulder, and I fall and break my arm or my leg or whatever. So there are those effects. But then it's also it's the essence of being alive. So again, literally and figuratively. It sounds so simple, and if I didn't have so much research backing it up, I would say it more tentatively. But it's hard to imagine, because it's so simple, that anyone would choose to be on automatic pilot. And the problem, you have lots.
Why do people?
People don't choose it. You have lots of people, lots of pop psychology, where people are telling you to be in the present. And that sounds very good, but it's really very facile advice, because when you're not in the present, you're not there to know you're not there. So you can't not be. Make yourself this is the way to be in the present. You notice. All of the cultures across the globe seem to have a premium in uncertainty. You want everybody to know. But since everything is changing, you can't know. So once you recognize that you can't know, you naturally stay tuned in. That's why I used in a moment before the example of being on a vacation. You're going to pay all that money to go someplace new. You're going to look for things that are new. And that's why it's so exciting.